So thank you for coming, everyone. My name is Matt Goldman, and I am going to talk to you this evening about what fills the white space. 10 surprising lessons from writing a book. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you know, we know that a book is a collection of printed words on a page, and where you don't see that print, where you don't see that type is the white space, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what are the things you don't see, what are the parts of writing a book, what goes into writing a book, the bits that you don't see. So my name is Matt Goldman. They call me Goldie here because we have a few Matts at SSW. If you want to look me up, you can see I am on our SSW People page there, or you can figure out which office I work in and come and visit us. So I'm a web and mobile developer. So at SSW, we're all full stack developers, so we all do everything. But a few of us have different specialties and things that we focus on. And for me, that's security and authentication, and also mobile development. And .NET MAUI, which is what I wrote the book about, you can see there it says I'm the author of .NET MAUI in Action, in case anyone didn't know, is about building mobile apps. The first thing that I want to talk about is how this all came about. So the unexpected path to authorship. So quick question, who here has ever thought about writing a book? No one here tonight, no one here. So I don't know if anyone at home has. So interesting story about how this came about. By way of background, I have been working at SSW now for just short of 5 years. I've got a lot of experience as a developer. I've been writing code for about 30 years. But this is the first time I've been doing it as a full-time job. So as a hobbyist since I was a very young teenager, and in my professional life since then, it's been something that I've had as part of my job, but not full-time. So it was interesting 5 years ago to turn up at SSW, having never worked as a full-time developer before, coming to one of the top development houses in the country with a reputation for, you know, very strict standards, and wondering how the heck I was going to get a job, but I managed to get through. The interview process and land a job here, which worked out quite well. But what worked out really well for me is that my background. So I've got a lot of background in consulting, management consulting, technical consulting. I also have my education formally is in science communication. So the thing that I'm actually qualified to do is explain things to people. And I was lucky to wind up at a company where I'm able to grow and develop as a developer, but also that values those skills as well. So SSW values writing because we have a lot of rules. We've got a public website called SSW Rules, which is a collection of 30 years worth of gems of wisdom, I guess. And SSW values my input into writing those, and obviously presenting. So we run these user groups every month, and we also do a lot of education through videos that we put online and through teaching. We have people come in here, and we do private, teaching and all that sort of stuff. So, so bringing that all together, I was able to find some opportunities here at SSW to put those skills together. Now, I mentioned that I'm interested in mobile development. So I first became interested in a technology called Xamarin 10 or so years ago. Not that long, it hasn't been out that long, but maybe about 7 years ago, 7, 8 years. Now, Xamarin is a technology that lets you write software apps for Android and iOS and other things later, but using .NET C# code. So I became very, very interested in mobile development because, in fact, I'll go back to what I said. I used to write code as a teenager. So I used to write games on a computer called the Amiga. I don't know if anyone remembers those back in the 90s, but there was a thing called public domain, and it was, so public domain means what you think it means what it means, but there was also a kind of community and a catalog called public domain where people could sell shareware, so you could have games that were not published by and other software that was not published by major studios and distributors, but just people doing it themselves, and you could sell it via this catalog and distribute it, and then if people want to buy it, they can buy it and send you some money. And for me, it was something that I did as a hobby and something that I just really enjoyed doing, and this realization that, wow, this is something that you can do, and earn money from was a real light bulb moment for me. And then, of course, over the years, software at the time was of course something that was dominated by huge tech companies. Microsoft had been around for a long time at that point, as had a bunch of other tech giants. But there were a lot of independent developers, and there were people making a living doing this, doing what I was doing, which was writing code in their bedroom, and that was amazing to me. Anyway, so when the first iPhone came out in 2007, and in fact it wasn't then, it was the second iPhone came out, and they introduced the App Store. Now the App Store, of course, apps on mobile devices are again dominated by huge tech companies, but there was a few years there where indie developers, like just standalone people doing their own thing, made some very successful apps and games and things like that, and that reignited that passion in me, so I became really interested in mobile development. So I started learning a bit about iOS and Android, and then when I learned of Xamarin, which lets you write that apps for those platforms in .NET code, which I already knew and was already doing, that was amazing. So I put some effort into learning Xamarin. When I came and started at SSW, there were a few people that had dabbled in it, but it wasn't something a lot of people here were that interested in. So it was a bit of a niche here for me at SSW. So what happened was Xamarin has now been replaced by .NET MAUI. So .NET MAUI is the evolution of Xamarin. It's got a lot of the same DNA. It's very similar in a lot of ways, but it's much more modern and it's much more aligned with the rest of the .NET ecosystem. So MAUI started to become a whisper, I guess, a few years ago, 4-ish years ago, and then about 3 years ago, Microsoft started previewing it, and there were talks from people at Microsoft. So I, of course, became very interested in this. And I gave a talk at a user group here at SSW, and I subsequently gave that same talk at a conference called NDC, which was called Cloudy with a Chance of Mobile. And this talk was about how you can use .NET everywhere. So on your mobile device, in the cloud, electronics, all that kind of stuff. And it was very preview, very early. And I sort of thought nothing more of it. It was just something I did because I was really interested and passionate, and I wanted to share that passion, and I was excited about what was over the horizon and what was coming. So as it happens, a gentleman by the name of Brian, who works as an acquisitions editor at a publisher called Manning, caught wind of this talk. I'd also, by the way, been doing some blog posts and other videos as well. It wasn't just this talk, but this guy caught wind of it, and he sent me an email asking if I was interested in writing a book. Now, earlier on, when I asked if anyone here has ever thought about writing a book, I had my own hand up, and not just for demonstration purposes. As it happens, purely by chance, as luck would have it, it is something that I have always thought about. So writing is another passion of mine, and I had never written a book before, but I have written a lot. I've written a lot of blog posts. I've written a lot of contributions to the rules here at SSW. I've done quite a lot of technical writing in previous roles. In fact, I mentioned consulting. So consulting was 90% writing, the management consulting I was doing. But I'd never written a book, and it was something I'd always thought about. So I got this email from Brian, and I came in and showed Adam. And Adam was horrified. Actually, that's not fair. He wasn't horrified, but he was like, "Whoa, writing a book." And I think he knew a lot better than I did how much effort was going to be involved in this. I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be easy, and I knew it was going to be huge. But I think Adam really had a much better grasp of just how monumental it was going to be. And I really, I kind of did know, but I didn't have an appreciation for it. So it was kind of a combination of luck, being in the right place at the right time. It was interesting because, as I said before, working at SSW, I wasn't a full-time developer. I was doing, software development in my work, but it wasn't, most of what I did. And I was encouraged by a few people. So there's a guy that works here called Luke. He actually didn't work here at the time. He started working here after me. But he's a very good friend of mine. He was working as a developer, and he'd been coming to training events here. I'd been coming here with him to user groups. And he encouraged me. He said, why don't you apply to SSW? And I kind of laughed. And he was like, no, I'm serious. And he really pushed me. And I mentioned the events that I used to come here to. And Xamarin, there was a Xamarin hack day that used to run here. And I used to come and attend the Xamarin hack day, again, just for fun. And Penny, who was running it and runs a lot of things here at SSW, she said to me one day, what are you doing? Is this, are you interested in what's your next move career-wise? And again, she kind of really pushed me and supported me. So Really, what I'm saying is a lot of it came about by luck. So, being in the right place at the right time, being at the right intersection of the niche for Xamarin and MAUI, being, in a company that encourages you to flex those skills and do the writing and do the presenting. So, and also, the good support of, good friends and colleagues. So, a big thank you to Luke and Penny and, of course, Adam. But, as I said, a lot of luck was involved in right place at the right time. But what I learned is that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And this is a kind of semi-famous quote from Seneca. And what I mean by this is that, there is such a thing as chance, of course, there's such a thing of randomness, but luck is something you make. And luck is, again, what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And an opportunity is chance. And to turn chance into luck, you have to be prepared. Now, of course, I wasn't prepared to write a book. I'd never written a book before. I really did not have a good appreciation for what was involved. But I guess what I was prepared for was to take on new challenges and try new things and push myself. And of course, I was motivated because it was something that I had always wanted to do. There's a couple of other good quotes here. So one of my favorites from Einstein about luck, God does not play dice with the universe. But there's one that many of you may know, Richard Branson, who said, if someone offers you an amazing opportunity, but you are not sure you can do it, say yes, then learn to do it later. And that's about being prepared for opportunities. And that's kind of what happened here. And it's interesting, as I said, it's something that I had always wanted to do. And in a roundabout way, without setting out to go out and write a book, it's something that happened for me anyway. And as I said, I attribute that to luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. So I want to talk about the second lesson that I learned. And this is something that I call health debt. So in software development and technology more broadly, we have this concept of technical debt. So do people here know what technical debt means? Yeah, most people. If you don't know, we have a video on SSW TV explaining it. It's I think it's pretty good, even if it is me, I'm in it. But the technical debt is this concept of when you are building something and you get to a point where something has not been done the right way. And this may be because it was unintentionally done wrong, it may be intentionally done wrong, it may have been right at the time and circumstances changed and it's not right anymore. It may be that you have decided to deliberately take a shortcut because you have a deadline that's a high priority, but we talk about this as being debt that you've incurred because you have to pay that back. And through the process of writing this book, same thing happened with what I call health debt. And the truth is my health did suffer through writing the book. It was a monumental undertaking. It was a huge commitment. And as I said, I was prepared for that, but I didn't, I thought that when I take on this challenge and I take on this book, everything else is going to have to kind of take a back seat. But what actually happened was everything else had to go on hold altogether, absolutely. So no other side projects, pretty much social commitments, everything ground to a halt for, nearly 2 years through the course of, from start to finish of writing this book. Now, the thing is, when you take on those kind of compromises and sacrifices for yourself, you can kind of accept that and write it off. But when you're doing it on behalf of other people, that is debt that you incur. And I call it health debt because, my health did suffer. I gained weight. I wasn't working out as much. A few other things. But, you call it goodwill debt, call it social debt. But most importantly was my family. So my partner was very accommodating. She really understood what I was doing and why I wanted to do it and was very supportive. She wasn't happy about it, but she understood and was supportive. And if, there's no way I could have done it without her being prepared to take on the responsibility of first of all, me being, mostly absent a lot of the time, but also, keeping the household and the family running. And that's debt that you incur. You can't just say, I'm just going to write that off on someone else's behalf. So that was something really interesting that I learned, and I think there's a good quote here from Abraham Lincoln where he says, You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. And just to recap, as I said, when you take on something and you make compromises, you can make compromises for yourself, but when you make compromises on behalf of others, that is debt that you incur and you have to pay it back. The next one, the myth of linear productivity. This was a real eye-opener for me. So, really interesting story. So after after that conversation with Adam, and he didn't say don't write a book, and he's been very supportive, but he was clearly apprehensive about it. But nevertheless, I went back and I spoke to Manning, I spoke to the publisher Manning, and I spoke to a few other people, and eventually signed a contract and decided to go ahead and write this book. And I got really excited, and I started writing, and on the first day of writing I wrote 1,200 words. And I thought, nailing this, I'll have this book done in no time. I actually can't remember what the final word count is. I should look that up. But it's about 450, 500 pages, so I don't know. But 1,200 words felt like a really good start to me. And if I'd have done that every single day, that would have been great. But that's not how productivity works. That's not how you move forward through the process of not just writing a book, but anything. So I found that there would be days where I would sort of hit that again. I don't think there were any days where I went beyond that, to be honest. But there were days when I hit that again, but they were few and far between. There were days where I would write 100 words, and there were days where I wouldn't write anything. And in fact, there was a period of several weeks at one point, about 4 weeks, where I literally didn't write a word. And that was very frustrating, and that was very difficult. In fact, I never made that time back up. I got back on track, but I never, there was no way I could double down to the point where I could get back that time that I'd lost. But what I realized was I had to stop beating myself up about not hitting that word count every day. And I realized that there were things that I was doing that were actually contributing to the progress of the book. Some of them very obvious and tangible, like demo projects. At the end of the day, it's a technical book with code samples in it. I had to write a whole bunch of applications to have as demos in the book. So, there were times when I did try as much as possible as I was writing the code to write the text alongside it. I could always go back and edit it, but I did try that as much as possible. But there were times where I had to park the writing and solve some actual difficult problems. One of the biggest challenges, of course, was that .NET MAUI hadn't actually come out when I started writing the book, and that was so hard. There was things that I was trying to get to work that wouldn't work, that worked before in Xamarin, and there was things that were completely different, and there were things that hadn't been done yet, and then there were things that later on would change, and I would have to go back and rewrite vast sections of the book, and all this was hugely frustrating. So there was a lot of time spent fiddling with code, research, looking at the source code of .NET MAUI itself, trial and error, experimentation. And on those days, I would feel really frustrated because my word count wasn't going up. But I had to learn to recognize that that was actual, real, tangible progress on the book. Other things like, diagrams and graphics that went in the book, a bit more obvious. But then there were some things there was one particular thing that I realized was actually a very important factor in contributing to the book that I hadn't realized really until after that sort of 4 weeks, after the period of desperately trying to claw back that time after that 4-week period where I didn't write any words. And what I realized is that downtime was a really important part of the process. So, I said there's days when I wasn't writing words and the word count wasn't going up, but I excused it by saying I was doing research or writing the demo projects or creating the graphics and figuring out responding to the changes in functionality and all that sort of stuff. But there were days when I actually did not do anything relating to the book at all. There were days when I had to just shut down and have downtime, and these were not days where I revisited some of the side projects or hobbies or something else. These were days when I literally did nothing. And it felt so wasteful and it felt very frustrating. But I came to learn that actually that was a really important part of the process, because what would happen was I'd start writing and I'd have a good cadence and velocity and start churning out words, and then my productivity would decrease to the point where it would just grind to a halt. And if I kept banging my head against the wall and writing 10 words a day every day, that's not going to get me anywhere. Whereas if I just take a day off and then get back to writing 500, 600, 700, 1,000 words, it's really important. And I had to really learn to recognize that downtime was not non-productive. It was actually contributing to the book getting finished. If I hadn't done it, the book wouldn't have been finished. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And I think there's two ways to look at this. And there's a good quote here I like from John Wooden, who's a basketball coach in the US. And he says, don't mistake activity with achievement. And this is something really important for all of us to recognize, I think, because there were days when felt like I was doing heaps of work, but it was all garbage nonsense. And there's about half the book again that didn't end up in the book. So, there's a lot that I did. And some of that was due to space constraints. Some of it was due to various other things, but a lot of it was just absolute garbage that just didn't belong in the book. So it's important to recognize that just because you're doing something, you're not necessarily actually achieving anything. But I also think the reverse is true, right? So I think it's important to not mistake a lack of visible output as inactivity, because sometimes the most meaningful work happens behind the scenes. And that's a quote from a very famous author called Matt Goldman. And I think it's important to recognize that even if there's nothing going on behind the scenes that you can see, sometimes that downtime, sometimes that doing nothing actually contributes to the thing getting finished. It's just important to recognize, I guess, when you're making excuses for yourself. That's off topic. So the next thing I want to talk about is the challenge of finding your voice amidst external pressures. So I mentioned here at SSW that we have this rules website, which has about 3,500 rules at last count, something like that. Does anyone know, by the way, what the rule count is? Anyone off the top of their head? Roughly 3,300 from Caleb here in the audience, thank you. So it's a lot, right? So the reason we have these is, aside from the fact that it's a way of documenting what we as a business have learned over the past 30 years, it also helps us take the cognitive load out of things that we really shouldn't have to think about. So if there's something that you need to do and there's already a well-defined way of doing it, if you come up with a better way, great. But if what you're doing is focusing on something else, you don't then want to need to figure out, well, how do I do this thing that someone has already solved? So that's why we have those. What that means is that we have some well-defined standards for how we do things here. Now, what it turns out is that Manning also has their own rules. So they've got a lot of standards and rules and guidance around how their authors should write their books. Now, as it turns out, this stuff is actually really good. So it's research-based and it's evidence-based. This is not arbitrary rules that they've come up with. These are all things that are backed by science that actually rigorously demonstrate that the techniques and approaches that they use and get you to use in their books actually result in demonstrably, measurably better learning outcomes for the people reading it. And I must admit, I ended up with a much better book because of it. And I as I said, I've done a lot of writing, and I've always felt like I'm a decent writer, but this is a much better book than it would have been if I hadn't have had the support of Manning and I hadn't had them supporting me. Now, there was a few people at Manning supporting me. There was a technical editor by the name of Gerald, and he is actually on the MAUI team at Microsoft. So he did have a lot of input, but I think the biggest thing for me for having Gerald there was a safety net. As I said, having never written a book before, having only really been a full-time professional developer for a couple of years at that point, having Gerald there gave me the confidence to write what I needed to write without worrying that I was going to publish something completely embarrassing, because he was going to stop that happening. But I also had what they called a development editor. And the development editor was a man named Connor, who was assigned to me by Manning, and his job was to review everything that I was writing every step of the way. Excuse me. And what he was doing, I mean, he wasn't a copy editor, so he did help with things that needed copy editing here and there if he saw something obvious. But that wasn't his job. His job was to make sure that I was writing a quality book. Right? So he wasn't correcting grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes. As I said, if he saw them, he would catch them. But his job was to make sure that I was following these standards and making sure that ultimately the book that I was writing was going to be a good book that was going to deliver what I needed it to do. And that meant that he challenged me on absolutely everything. And he's non-technical, and when there were things that I'd written and he could read and he could clearly see that I was explaining what it meant, great. But then there were other things where he would say, I'm not convinced that this works, I'm not convinced that you're doing this in the most effective way. And he would push me, and as I said, I ended up with a much better book for it by following these rules. But what that meant was that there were certain things that I was pushed to do in certain ways that didn't necessarily reflect my voice. Not always, but sometimes. And to give you a really roundabout example to start with, there was so there are sidebars in the book. I'm assuming you all know what sidebars are. Do people know what a sidebar is in a book? I'm guessing. Yep. Well, I'll find an example. But a sidebar is essentially a break away from the main text where you say something. Here's one, right? So on these pages here, you've got the main flow of the text, and then down here is this little grey box, which is just a bit of extra information. That's called a sidebar. So I had a sidebar at one point in this book explaining what link is and what lambda expressions are. So for those of you that don't know, it's a particular way of writing queries in code. I won't go into too much more detail. Now this book is targeted at people that already know how to write C# code and write .NET code. It doesn't teach you that. And I ummed and ahed a bit about, do I keep this bit in the book or not? And it was a big debate, and I felt that maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. There was question around the development editor said no, don't have it in. The technical editor said yes, keep it in. The other way around, maybe, I can't remember. I'd have to go back to those emails from years ago. And it went back and forth a bit, and I ultimately decided I would keep it in. It's a sidebar, it's not the main body of the text. It's just a sidebar. If people want to skip over it and ignore it, they can. So it stayed in. It's in the book. It is in there. And the process through Manning is they have this thing called MEEP, right? So MEEP stands for Manning Early Access Program. What that meant was I would write a chapter. I would send it to Connor, development editor. He would send it back to me and get me to rewrite it. This would go back and forth a few times. Eventually we'd send it off to Gerald, and he would come back to me. And actually, I have to say, Gerald was also really good outside of the technical stuff. He also picked up on spelling and grammar and structural things as well, like way beyond the scope of what he was being paid for. So he was really good. He would come back to me, and eventually we would have a draft that we would say, this is the first draft, and then we'd send it to MEEP. And what that meant was that people could buy the book early before it was finished and get chapters live as I was writing them. So they went into this online book and people were reading them. So the chapter went up with the sidebar and link on it, and I immediately started getting, so there's comments and a forum on there, and immediately started getting like slammed from people saying, this is insulting, we know what this is, why is this in here? So, finding the right balance there is quite hard. And in this particular case, so I mentioned about the standards and the practices that Manning have. So one of the things that they do before you even start writing the book is they get you to complete a bunch of information. So questionnaires about what is your book going to say? What are you going to teach? How is it going to do it? They get you to write the table of contents first. That's actually a trick I learned in my consulting career as well. So whenever I was doing big documents for clients, we would always write the table of contents first, and then all the headings, and then you just go in and fill it out, and it is actually quite a good way of doing it. You can always come back and change it. But one of them was I had to complete this document called Minimally Qualified Reader. And this is a very, very rigorous, detailed document where you explain at length, in great detail, what it is that you're going to say, who the people are that you're targeting, what level of detail do they know, on what topics, what do they do. It was really, really in-depth to really distill and identify who the people are that should be reading this book. So I went through this process, and again, there was back and forth, and there was quite a lot of effort that went into it. And on the back it says, for experienced .NET developers. So that's how that all wound up. But nevertheless, like that should give you enough comfort to not have to worry about things like, do I put a sidebar and link and lambda expressions? And the truth is, you're never going to get it right. And the challenge here in terms of finding your voice and the external pressures is when those people do come back and when those people do complain and say, this is insulting, we don't need to know it. But what you don't hear from is, of the 24 people that were doing those reviews at the time and the people participating in MEEP, you know, the other 20 or so of them that don't say anything, those are the ones you've got to kind of focus on and not try not to get lost in the noise of the people shouting the loudest. The other one for me, though, was Americanisms, right? So I am English, as you can probably tell. Well, I'm actually Australian now, but I was born and grew up in England, and I love the English language. I love writing, and there are certain things that are spelled differently in American English. I had to swallow that very, very early on. There was if I have to spell colour without a U, if I have to use a Z instead of an S, I didn't want to do those things, but I could kind of tolerate that because at the end of the day, they're an American company, they're an American publisher, it's their book, their target audience is mostly in the US. That's fine, no problem with that. But then what happened was, right at the very end of the book, after I'd finished, the first draft and actually completed the first draft of the book and it was finished, it went off to copy editors, and they came back with a whole bunch of changes that they wanted. Some of them, okay, whatever. Some of them were, when I say that, I mean some of them I didn't really care about and thought that's fine, whatever. Some of them were very good, where they found things and said this should be changed for this reason, and I said, yeah, okay, that's good. But there was one particular hill I just chose to die on, and I'll never forget this. I wrote in the book something about get to grips, and I said you will have to get to grips with, and I was talking about, I have to go back and check, but I was talking about a particular design pattern called MVVM, and I think I was saying, or maybe I was talking about some naming convention, and what I said was, you can do whatever you like, but given that this isn't an official documented you must do it this way approach, but this is what most people were doing. So any teams that you join or any clients you work for are probably going to do it this way, so you need to get to grips with this approach. The copy editors struck that out and said, change this to come to grips. They said, in America we say come to grips. And I just said, I'm not changing that. I said, spelling is one thing. I said, changing things one way or another is one thing. But I have never in my life said come to grips, nor would I. And me putting that makes it not my authentic voice. And I know it sounds petty, but it was important to me that this is my book. It's my name on the cover as the author. It was important to me that it was my authentic book. And I didn't dig my heels in, and I didn't say this must say get to grips. But what I did say is I'm not saying come to grips. So I said, let me just rewrite this whole sentence so it's not an issue. And eventually at this stage into the process and getting so close to the whole thing going to print, I think they just decided that they didn't want to take time for me to go away and rewrite it. And they ended up letting me get to grips. And I think in that case, it may be that it's not the way in America, but it is a known that people would understand it. So perhaps that's why they allowed that one. So as I said, it sounds petty, but it is about picking your battles. And I think there was a lot of things that I did have to compromise on in terms of structural changes. As I said, there was about half again the length of the book that didn't make it into the book, and there were things that I was deeply passionate about, desperately wanted to go into this book, but there's not enough space. Like printed books cost money, they're expensive, and if you want a much bigger book, it's going to be a much more expensive book, and for that reason I had to cut things out. Compromises like that, compromising on the spelling of colour and italicized or whatever word I use a Z instead of an S, that's fine, but I needed to make sure for myself that on the one hand I was retaining my authentic voice and being myself, but on the other hand not being a dick, right? I didn't want to be unreasonable, and that's a fine edge to balance, and that is quite tough, and that was a lesson for me, was really striking that balance, especially as someone so passionate about language and writing in English, especially the compromising on spelling thing. And I surprised myself with how easily I gave that up, actually, to be honest. As I said, finding your voice, being authentic to yourself. This is a well-known quote from Shakespeare, from Hamlet. This above all, to thine own self be true. And that was the lesson that I learned. So the next one, constructive criticism is a double-edged sword. So I spoke a bit about the rules at Manning, and I spoke about how by following those rules and by following a rigorous standard and approach and a structured approach, it's not a diary. It's not, something for me to sit there and just freeform write whatever I want. It's a technical manual that people are going to buy and expect to actually learn something from. And for that reason, there's these rules. But that comes with feedback and it comes with criticism. So I mentioned Connor, whose job it was to ensure that I was writing a quality product. Now, he never, not once gave me any negative criticism, because that's, very professional and not his style. But what he did do was he did tell me about the things that I had done wrong, not just in terms of Manning's rules, in terms of things that were grammatically incorrect, structured in a way that could have been better, but also, the things about the Manning rules as well. Now, I don't mind having criticism and negative feedback. None of that bothered me at all, right? And as I said, there was none of it that was ever malicious or even negative feedback. It was just, this is how to improve this part. But dear God, the thing that irritated me no end was sometimes I'd be reading his draft that he'd sent back to me, and there's just a throwaway comment somewhere, and I won't give specific examples, but there were comments that I would read where he had said something that sounded very trivial and throwaway, and I would read it and I would just think, you've written 4 words here. Do you not understand that I would have to throw away this whole chapter and rewrite this whole chapter? And then other times it'd be like, if you want me to do that, I have to change the whole order of the book. I have to move 4 different chapters around and change things. And these things were very frustrating. Now, eventually we settled into a really, really good rhythm, and we developed a really good synergy, and working with Connor is one of the most productive professional relationships I've ever had, and he was fantastic. What I learned was that a lot of that is down to me and my interpretation. And one thing that became very clear was that there are certain things that he had said that were, this needs to be changed, but if it needed to be changed, he would say this needs to be changed. And other times there were suggestions or questions, and the questions were genuine questions, and the suggestions were just suggestions, and they were for me to take or leave as I see fit. As I said, in accepting in the cases where he said, you actually do have to change this. So that was, that's a reflection on myself, I think. But, it's important, I think, to take that criticism on board and not get dejected. And as I said, sometimes feedback can be negative, sometimes criticism can be hurtful. And in fact, I did a video on this last year with our general manager here at SSW. His name's Yuli. Has anyone here seen that video? One in the audience? No? So Yuli and I had a conversation about, so most people understand that when it comes to feedback, it's up to you as an individual to assess it and kind of harden up, not take it, personally, and decide whether or not you actually care, whether it's valuable. I can't remember who this quote is from, but there's that saying: "Don't take feedback from anyone don't take advice from anyone you wouldn't take criticism from," or I don't know, I can't remember. Don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from, whatever. But the point is, when you get something that's negative and it makes you think, well, that's no good, let it wash over you, or pick out the valuable parts. But what Yuli and I were talking about was the other side, is if it's important to you that the person that you're giving this feedback to takes it on board, then there are certain ways that you can deliver that feedback and craft it in a way that is, first of all, not going to be confrontational and is not going to be immediately confronting to them. And it's going to be delivered in a way that's going to let them receive it, hopefully subjectively. But the point is, when you get negative feedback, you do have to learn to take it on the chin, frankly. And, as I said, in my case, the rules and the feedback that I was getting from Connor made this a much better book. And another lesson that isn't one of mine here, but something that I learned through that particular part of the process is that being good at writing doesn't make you a good writer. And I think I was good at writing before I started this book. I was good at constructing sentences and paragraphs and, you know, documents and what have you. But that doesn't make you a good writer. One thing that you've probably noticed through my ramblings that I'm very bad at is being concise. So that's something I always need help in. But also just in terms of how you structure things in a way that's going to be effective and deliver that teaching. So feedback is really important, and criticism is really important. But as I said in the previous one about learning to find your voice amid those pressure, it's really, really important to find the right balance. And it is quite hard. And it is hard even when you're trying to be objective to not get taken aback a bit. But I have found that Winston Churchill has something quite useful to say about this, and this is something that's really great to keep in mind. And what he says is that criticism may not be agreeable, but it is necessary. It fulfills the same function as pain in the human body. It calls attention to an unhealthy state of things. And I think it's always good to remind yourself of that, and always good to remind yourself that most of the time you're receiving feedback, you're receiving criticism, it's actually to help you. Sometimes someone is just being a dick, don't worry about it. So this is probably the one that most people here are expecting to hear about, which is perseverance through emotional highs and lows. And as I said, the book was all-consuming. There was a good year at least. So the whole process went about 1.5 years to 2 years, from the very first call or the very first email to the printed copies landing in my hands at my home. But there was a good 12 months where it was literally book, work. Wake up, write the book a bit, go to work, write the book a bit more, go to sleep. That was it. Some days it was a slog, as I said, and really hard. Other days it was a pure joy. Absolutely, you know, wonderful days where I was being really productive and really enjoying every step of it. And there's a saying here, there's a saying that's kind of well known, which is that the definition of discipline is doing something when you don't want to do it. So, you know, if you think about, you know, there are days when you wake up and you don't feel like going to the gym, so you don't go. Discipline is going on those days when you don't feel like it and you still do it, right? The same thing with the book. Now, I think, you know, most people know about this in general and expected this about the book, right? But I learned something interesting, actually. I read a book a few years ago, which I forget whether it was Teach Yourself Writing a Novel or Writing a Novel for Dummies. As I said, this is something I've thought about before. I can't remember which book it was, but I remember reading in this book about something called the 5-chapter problem. Now, the 5-chapter problem is that most authors, and I'll come back to that in a moment, have this 5-chapter problem where they'll write the first 5 chapters of the book, and that's when they run out of steam and they don't write anymore. So I actually went back to my folder on my computer of like all my writing projects, and I went through and every single one of them had 5 chapters. So that was a real eye-opener for me. So the discipline is getting to that stage and you know, persevering and, you know, keep going. So another thing that motivated me through the days when I wasn't, you know, I woke up in the morning and I didn't quite feel like writing that day and I just wasn't feeling it, was this isn't really a saying that's attributable to anyone. This is kind of something that is known in writing circles, I guess, or in the writing community. And that is the difference between an author and someone who isn't an author is someone who's written a book. And that's really it. And I always thought of myself as, you know, an author who just hadn't written a book yet, but that kind of, by definition, made me not an author. But I wanted to be an author. I wanted to. And that's, you know, on the days where I didn't feel like writing, and on the days where I felt like my life was falling apart, and on the days where I'd had, you know, extra long days at work and everything was stressful and stressful at home and all that. And now, granted, as I said earlier, that there was some, you know, sometimes on those days you have to say, I'm taking a break, I'm not doing it. But other times, you know, that's what I would think about. And I thought, you know, I want to be an author. I want to be someone that has written and has finished a book. So that kept me going. And the other thing was, visualization. I think visualization is obviously a powerful technique in motivation, as most people know. And for me, I mentioned that day when the printed copies first turned up on my doorstep. So that day I was thinking about that, thinking about the ring at the doorbell and getting the box and bringing it inside and opening it and getting the books out and seeing my name on the cover of a book that I could hold in my hands in front of me. And I just kept thinking about that, and that's what would keep me going. That's what would keep me going. And I found that it was a stark reminder that intention and identity are not enough. Right? It's our actions that truly define us. And I have a very well-known quote, I think, that summarizes this up quite nicely, which is from Batman. It's not who I am underneath, it's what I do that defines me. And that's what kept me going. So the next one is when the end feels like the beginning. And this was really hard. So the book, as I said, Manning's process is quite rigorous, as I said, and there was a whole bunch of back and forth with writing drafts, sending it to them, get them to send them back to me, rewrites, blah, 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 blah. Now, eventually I got to the point where I had finished the first draft. So I sent it in and they accepted it, and I was like, oh my God, thank God it's done, thank God it's done. No, actually it wasn't done. So what happens next is their process that they call sending it to production. Now, sending it to production is the process of taking a manuscript, which is what I had written, and turning it into a printed book or a published book, because electronic as well. And that involves reviews of all the graphics, typesetting, some rewrites as well, actually. And God, it just felt like it dragged on and on and on. And I got a similar story, actually. So about 10 years ago, I did something called an Ironman. So does anyone here know what an Ironman is? One? Anyone else? No? Well, it's a triathlon, but it's a very, very long triathlon. So it's just short of a 4K swim, and then a 180K bike ride, and then a marathon. And that was really hard. And through training for that, and eventually on the day doing it, I used the same technique that I mentioned before, which is visualization. So when you do an Ironman, so if you complete an Ironman race within the time limit, you are an Ironman. And when you cross the finish line, an announcer says your name and says, Matt Goldman, you are an Ironman. And the thing that kept me going, not just through the training, but on the day, and there were times on the day where I just wanted to lie down by the side of the road and die, and believe me, I thought about it a few times. But the thing that kept me going was hit in my head thinking, no, that's I can't wait to hear that. And then by the time I crossed the finish line, and I was terrible at this, by the way, it took me over 16 hours, and the cutoff is 17, so I just made it. When I finally made it over the finish line, I was so exhausted and wrecked, I didn't even hear them say it. Right, so I didn't even hear it, that thing that I was holding out for that whole time. Now, it's not the same thing that happened with the book, but it's kind of similar. And I mentioned that, I had that visualization of that moment of getting the books in my hand, and I was really, excited about that. When the day finally came, I was so burned out by this book, I just didn't care. The box came, I opened it, brought them inside, I looked at them, and I wasn't, I didn't have negative feelings about it. It was like, oh, that's nice, and that was it, But the funny thing is, which I would never have been able to say until about 5 minutes ago, was when I picked this book up about 2 minutes ago and was talking about that visualization, I had that feeling. And I literally finally just got that feeling now after a year. I think it's a year since I had these books. So I think the lesson there is that, life isn't about these narrative arcs that we think of, that we know from fiction, and it's not about these big, huge crescendo endings. It's just one day to the next, and that's life. The visualization techniques are important, and those feelings are great when you get them, but they're not what keep you going. And always remember the ending to the movie 8 Mile. Who's seen that, 8 Mile? Anyone? No? So the movie is about it's based on the rapper Eminem. It's autobiographical. It's inspired by certain parts of his life, and the whole build-up of this book is of the movie. Sorry, is that he's going to participate in this big rap battle at the end, and he's the underdog, and people have called it the Rocky of rap. And at the end, he wins, and it's this great big moment, and then he just walks outside, puts his coat on, and goes to work. And it's like that's really powerful for me, at least, anyway. And I think, as I said, the visualization and the motivation is great, but life is about more than that. And as per Ralph Waldo Emerson here, the reward of a thing done well is having done it. And for me, I've done it. I've written a book. I'm holding it right here. No one can ever take that away from me. Whatever happens, I have written a book, and that is, for me, enough. Even without those big fireworks moments that I was holding out for, that is just the main thing for me. But as it happens, there are surprising rewards that you're not expecting. I talk about here validation and the true reward, and the feedback from readers and the people that I was actually writing the book for, the thing that you think would be the front of my mind, I didn't even actually think about it at all. But one day when I started seeing people talk about the book online, and I started seeing reviews, and I started people saying it's good, but most importantly, started people saying, I'm reading this book and I'm learning for it. That was amazing. Like I just hadn't thought about it. I hadn't expected it or anticipated it. And when I saw that, that was just incredible. That was a huge moment for me. Although, funny story, I remember once seeing on the .NET MAUI subreddit on Reddit, I saw a post with the title, anyone reading .NET MAUI in action? And I thought, oh my God, what's it going to say? And I clicked on it and it said, it's quite good. And I thought, oh, awesome. But, oh my God. And I read it, and I read a problem that the person had with the book. As it turned out, the problem was actually not to do with the book itself. It was to do with accessing an electronic version of the book online, and I was able to solve that for that person. But yeah, there was a bit of an emotional roller coaster there. But yeah, as I said, the unexpected reward there was just, as I said, right, I've written a book. No one can take that away from me. But knowing that that book is actually helping people, and people are getting joy from it and learning it, that's incredible. And I'll quote Ralph Waldo Emerson again here. And he says, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, that is to have succeeded. And I think that to me is probably the most important outcome of the book. That was just amazing. So I want to talk about boundaries and future commitments. So boundary setting is an important skill for everyone, as we know. Maintaining boundaries is a harder skill. Now, I had to compromise a lot of boundaries for this book. As I said, my personal life, my social life, my other commitments, my other hobbies and side projects, and to a large extent my family, suffered for this book. And, but there were some firm boundaries that I wasn't prepared to compromise on. Now, one of those I will say is that when I signed the contract with the publisher for this book, one of the clauses says that if I miss deadlines, they reserve the right to bring in another author who would help me finish the book. And now that was, I have to say, one of the things that really pushed me and really motivated me as well, because I thought, no, this is my first book. It's going to be me, my book. I'm the author. That's it. So that was a big motivator for me. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But what I learned is that boundaries, boundaries are important, especially when it comes to future commitments. And what I mean here is the big question, will I write another book? And that's what people have asked me. And you know what, I hope so. But there are certain things I would definitely never do again. I will never write a book on an emerging technology again. Now, granted, there are people that do that as their full-time job, as technical writers. That's different, right? But in addition to a full-time job, a family, and all my other commitments, taking on a book about a technology that's still emerging, that is not something I would do. And that I will say firmly, categorically, I will never do that again. Other things, well, so I mentioned that there were things in the book that I had to leave out for various reasons. as it happens, some of the feedback from the very early readers in the pre-release stage, so in the sort of production phase, when the early reviewers, was, hey, what about including this topic? The topic is testing, by the way, so I don't talk about testing in the book. So the publisher came back to me and said, so we want to talk to you about getting started straight away on a second edition. And I said, no, no. I said, not unless you want to find me another house and family, because I'll be out on my arse if I do that. So look, I think I will write a second edition to this book one day, but it would be under very different circumstances. And I think if I were to commit to doing that or another book, I would probably compromise on that boundary of having another author a lot more than I would have for that first book. And I think something important to remember here is that I said that boundary setting is an important skill that we all need to learn and understand, but the main thing is that boundaries are something that you set for yourself. So you can set boundaries for others, but you can't really set consequences for others. You can't stop people. You can explain to other people what your boundaries are, but you can't really stop people violating your boundaries. All you can do is decide what you're going to do if that happens. So Jane Porter, who is an author here, says you can't set boundaries without setting consequences. And I think the important thing to remember here is when you set boundaries for yourself, you have to set consequences for yourself as well. And you have to be prepared to compromise. So I think my next book, the second edition of this, will be a very different experience. Lastly, I want to talk about the dream versus reality. So I mentioned that I had dreamed of being an author for a long time. I mentioned the things that weren't the reality, like that feeling of elation and opening the box and getting the books for the first time. And, you know, nevertheless, having the book and holding it in my hand with my name on it is a huge moment. But I think probably like any aspiring author, my biggest dream would be to one day walk into a bookshop and see my book on the shelf. And that's something I think would be amazing and an incredible experience. But with tech books in general, you just don't really get that much anymore. You know, bookshops are in decline. There's competition from online bookstores. Bookshops, there are fewer of them now. They're getting smaller. Keeping tech books on the shelves is not really viable for them. You know, they have to compete with online resources, blogs, articles, videos, all that sort of stuff. Not only that, this is a niche technology. So this is a real niche within a niche. So for me, I kind of had to learn that dream of walking into a bookshop one day and seeing my book on the shelf was, you know, not something that was going to happen with this book. Or was it? And what I learned, you never know. Sometimes dreams do come true. But the real lesson here is this quote from Michael Jordan. So he said that some people want it to happen, some people wish it to happen, and others make it happen. And yes, I made it happen. I took this book into the bookshop down the road and I put it on the shelf to take those photos, because it's all about making the dream come true. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, I would love to answer any questions. But there's also a QR code here. If you have any feedback about this talk, if you would like to let me know anything you particularly liked or anything that you think I can do better, please fill in this form. We also have, I forgot to tell you at the start, we have an app called SSW Rewards, which is a .NET MAUI app. And it actually wasn't originally, it was a Xamarin app that got upgraded to .NET MAUI. And if you use that app, you can get points and you can exchange those points for some cool prizes. Do we have any? We don't have any demo swag here right now, but you know, you can get like a Me Band, some shirts and mugs and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you this is that if you complete this form, you'll get 500 points, and those points can be used to trade for prizes. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to me talk about my book. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm Matt Goldman from SSW.